All right, so we're here today to talk about the many roles of lawyers in social justice initiatives. And I wanted to begin this conversation simply with the idea, some ideas about what lawyers do generally, not just social justice lawyers, but lawyers in general, because I think there is some uncertainty about the many roles that lawyers have. So there are a lot of things that we can do with a law degree. There are some things that only lawyers are permitted to do, but there are certainly many things that would benefit from having a lawyer involved in them. So I want to get started with that, just that idea. And I'm going to start this by having us do a few exercises to get us oriented to the whole notion of lawyering and lawyers' roles. And the first one is just an exercise to be thinking about what are the values in the profession. So we've got a handout here, or it's going to be up on the PowerPoint here, a series of questions that I just want you to answer yes or no. And you can, I don't want you to think about these too deeply. It doesn't have to be a yes or a no in every circumstance, just generally, do you agree or disagree with this particular statement? Okay, so after you've had a chance to do that, the next thing I want you to do is I want you to take a look at this list, and I want you to put them in order of importance. What is the most important thing, the most important value that you see, down to what's the least important value? So just take a minute or so to do that. All right, so the final thing that I want us to do is I want your group to try to reach some kind of consensus. So you can do this in small groups, or you can do it as a bigger general group. And I want you to try to reach some agreement about what is the most, at least about what is the most important value and what is the least important value. And see how far you can get with that in just a couple of minutes. Okay. So when I run through this with my students, what I find is that the first questions are pretty easy to answer. It's pretty easy to say yes to virtually all of these questions, and that's important. But what's harder is to try to then decide, well, if they come in conflict with each other, which one is going to be more important? So what's the most important? What's the least important? And hardest of all is trying to reach some kind of agreement among ourselves about what's the most important, what's the least important. And I talk about this because these values of our profession that we might share often come in conflict with each other. So we can't always be true to any particular value. And it's an important question to ask, not just of ourselves, but of our work environment. So you not only want to be thinking to yourself, what is it that you believe in, but when you're looking at your boss, or you're looking at the organization you're working in, or the government, or whatever it is, you want to be thinking, well, what are their values, and how do they rank these things, and what's most important there? So there's obviously room for difference of opinion, but it's something that we really need to be thinking about. All right, so the next thing I want to do is, we've looked at the values of the profession. I want to look at what are the tasks that lawyers actually perform. What do we actually do? So for this, what I want you to do is make an exhaustive list of tasks that lawyers do. You can do this in different ways. You can each individually take a piece of paper or whatever and write everything down, or you can, if you have a small group, you can go around the room a couple of times and each person name one particular thing that lawyers do, and then you can kind of compare where you are. When I've done this with my students, I've come up with this, most recently we came up with the beginnings of a list. These are some of the things that lawyers do. They fill out paperwork, they organize, they counsel, they listen, they explain, they revise, they sit through meetings, they educate, they crunch numbers, they confront people, they investigate, they do research. So that's just a partial list, and I'm sure your list is even bigger and grander than this. But so for now, I just want us to think about how many different tasks that lawyers have, and then I want us to just put this list aside. We're going to come back to it in a little bit. And then the third orienting exercise I want to do is I want to think about our workplace environment. And this is an exercise that you're not going to be able to do, as you're watching this tape, but maybe do in your spare time or a little bit later. What I want you to do is I want you to go into a workplace environment, and it could be your school or it could be an office where you work, and answer these questions. I usually have the students make a chart of these questions, but you can just write down notes about them. And the questions are, when you're looking at your work environment, what are the types of legal problems that are being dealt with? Who are the client groups or the interests that are being served? What do lawyers actually do in that? What's the role of lawyer in the organization? How many projects or cases are actually going on in the work environment? How do those cases or projects get started? How do people decide what is going to go forward and what isn't going to go forward? How do people learn what the facts are? Who does the research? Who does the analysis? And then finally, what kinds of problem-solving methods are used? So for example, particularly in the legal context, we're talking about legislation, litigation, mediation. What are the problem-solving methods that the lawyers use? And the reason I want you to do this is that I think it seems like a sort of a simple thing. We look around and we know where we're working. We know, we think we know what the goals and the methodologies of the place are. But what I find is when people do this, they actually are surprised by how much they don't know about the legal environment they're in. And so it becomes really important to ask some of these questions, because you want to know these things. You want to know what's the place and where are their values, the kinds of values that we talked about just a little bit ago. Another thing that I actually ask people to do after this is that and sometimes right after, and sometimes you could wait a little bit and come back to this, and that is to now take what you have found out, the information you found out, and make a picture of it. So you want to get not only a sense of not only want to gather the information about it, but I think it helps to kind of visually see how does this organization play out. And so you can do this, as this demonstrates, lots of different ways: an organizational chart, you could do a timeline, you could do stick figures, you could do anything that you really want. But what this tells us is whether the organization is dynamic, is it people-centered, is it idea-centered, is it an organization in which action becomes really important? Do we know whether how people relate to each other, how priorities are set, what the hierarchy is, all of those kinds of things. And again, we get a sense of what the professional values are that are governing the work environment. So just finally, the takeaways from all this, what I really want you to understand from these orienting exercises is that it's important for us to pay attention and to get a deeper understanding of our own environment. We want to broaden our perspective, not just think about what's right in front of our face, but think about what the rest of the atmosphere is like. And we also want to begin a habit of organizing and categorizing the information that we have, and as well as a habit of observation and listening. Okay, so so speaking of this last one, in terms of listening and observing, I want to spend a little bit of time then moving to exercises that actually increase our awareness of specific things. And what I want to start with is our awareness of lawyers themselves. So what I would like you to do, again, in your spare time, or maybe you even have an opportunity if you've got access to the internet, is to pull up some images of lawyers. And and take a look at those images. And I can give you some examples of things that my students have pulled up. So often we pull up famous lawyers or fictional lawyers that people know something about. But so some of the examples have been Lenin, Gandhi, President Obama, the First Lady Michelle Obama, Fidel Castro, Franz Kafka, Tony Blair. There are a lot of people who are lawyers out there. So, you know, kind of pull up some images, compare them. And when you get those images, well, then what I want you to do is kind of take some notes on them, and just brief notes, and write down what attributes you see in these images of the lawyer. So, for example, you might see anger, you might see confusion, kindness, you might see somebody who's distrustful, you might see somebody who's determined, that sort of thing. So just take a couple minutes and note those things down. The purpose for these images is that what I want you to be thinking about is, first of all, we're seeing how many different roles a lawyer can assume, but we're also getting a sense of what of the personal attributes that are associated with the kind of work that we do. And I think you're going to be able to see that as you start to compare the words that you've written in response to the images that you've got in front of you. So keep those things in mind, because those images and the attributes that belong to a lawyer are something that you want to be thinking about as you're thinking about the kinds of roles for social justice lawyers. So those are the images of the lawyers. Now, the next thing I want us to think about is, what are the symbols in our work environment? And these are some common symbols that we have for law and justice. But there are, there are a lot of other kinds of things that we look at, and not just in the courtrooms and not just in our government buildings, but elsewhere. Below every work surface, there is a work culture, and that culture gets expressed in many ways. It gets expressed by various symbols, it gets expressed by its heroes, it gets expressed by its rituals. So, for example, here in my own law school, if I walked around here without really distancing myself from my current role, what I might notice are that there are a whole lot of photographs of white men on the walls. We have a very large picture of a former president, or former vice president, Walter Mondale, whose name is on our building. So he's a kind of hero here. We have different kinds of rituals, and one of the nicer rituals that I would say in many meetings here, we have a policy where if you want to speak, people raise their hand, that's one thing. But if you really want to talk, you get to raise 2 fists, and so you get to interrupt the queue and come in before other people if you've got something really important to say. So that's the kind of ritual that I'm talking about. At another office I have in the community, they have very different symbols. On the walls are pictures, paintings from local artists. They have their ritual, one of their meeting rituals is somebody will distribute a quote and everybody is asked to comment on the quote. So it's a little bit different kind of approach to how we think about meetings. So you can see that in different environments we've got different things going on, and so that's what I would like you to focus on for just a couple minutes, right when you get a chance, to just write down some of these things, note down some of the rituals and the symbols and the of the environment that you're in. And then when you do that, after you do that, you can talk a little bit about, well, what's the meaning of these things? And just to give you some examples, let's look at a few things that maybe are sending us some messages, and let's see what we get out of that. All right, so here are some law offices. So just note down, what do you think the messages are in these environments? All right, so here's the next set of pictures. These are buildings, law office buildings. if you're approaching a law office, what's the message you get? All right, so now we're inside an office and meeting with people. So, what are the messages? And some different office pictures. Okay. All right, so that's pretty much it for our orienting exercises. And so now what I want to do is I want to think about, we've talked a little bit about the values that are part of the profession and what lawyers do. And now I would just want to focus on kind of what our aspirations are as social justice lawyers and what the realities are for this. So in terms of law, there are a number of things that law can do. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the theories about what lawyers can and can't do. Basically, we're talking about what they can do to make changes. I mean, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about social justice law. And the kinds of things that lawyers can do, let's cover them. They can create rights and remedies mostly through legislation, but sometimes through other things, through court proceedings. The law can alter the conduct of government. It can alter the conduct of its citizens and of private entities. Sometimes the law can express an ideal or a standard, not necessarily an enforceable one, but something that to which that we want to aspire. And finally, sometimes the law can actually change cultural attitudes and patterns. And it's this last one that I really want to focus on because it's particularly important, I think, to people who are interested in social justice lawyering. And this idea of changing cultural attitudes and patterns, some people would say is part of all law, that lawyers are always involved in that, not directly, but in an indirect way. But in order for a cultural shift to take place, a couple of things have to happen. For one thing, in order for it to really be called a cultural shift, it has to affect daily life. It has to be something that's very broad in its application. It can't be that unless there's some kind of public awareness of it. So if it's really under the surface, probably not so much of a cultural shifting. There has to be some consensus about legitimacy. So in other words, somebody could from on high change things and change the rules, and that might be put in place. But unless there's consensus about legitimacy of that change, the culture hasn't really shifted. And for this to happen, there has to be, again, sort of consistent and continuous enforcement of whatever it is that the new rules are trying to do. So when we think about this, there are many people who would say that the most acceptable kinds of change come from the legislatures, and that kind of change is most likely to create long-term cultural shifting. All right, so why is that? Well, the theory is that a legislative change is characterized by an open, public, and often a prolonged debate about the value of this kind of rule change, and that it's subject to critique and often even subject to the ballot box. So that's the theory behind it. I don't think not everybody buys into that, but it's something definitely to think about. Others say that law is really essentially conservative, and that because lawyers are taught to and have a penchant for compromise, that they're trained to think about both sides of the issues, not just both sides, but many sides of an issue. They're not in any kind of position to make change. They're certainly not in a position to be revolutionary. And there are many who would contrast that with other kinds of social activism, and the way in which so other social activists look at how we frame injustice. So lawyers, however, often assume that law and legal process are the essence of of social justice. I would say many people don't share that view. In fact, some activists would say that lawyers actually get in the way of this sort of thing. But for us, I think what we really want to be thinking about is whether we are sort of on the conservative bent or on a more revolutionary bent, we have to be aware of the fact that whatever we're doing is actually contributing to what I would call the social memory. So that every little bit that we do actually is making a difference in the way in which law and process and legal procedures are perceived. And it's the kind of everything that we do contributes to those images like we were that we were looking at the beginning, and at our impressions of lawyers. That again we were thinking about earlier in this talk. So this takes us to this whole notion of systemic issues, and social justice lawyering is very basically about thinking about and responding to systemic issues. So before we get too far in that, I think it's really important to just understand what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic issues. And this is the way I would explain it. I think most of the time, no matter what kind of practice we're in, most of our practice is going to be involved with helping individuals. And that's true even in a social justice context. So for example, we might represent clients who are drafting wills, or we might represent people who are concerned about unfair hiring practices, or we might defend people charged with crimes, or defend medical professionals against claims of malpractice, whatever it is. But so we're working with individuals, but no matter what we're doing, underneath there's some other bigger policy or issue that could be at stake. And it's this bigger problem that's underneath that I'm actually looking, that we're actually looking at. So what are we talking here? What we're talking about with regard to this systemic issues is we're talking about looking at the whole forest, not just the individual trees, which is what we often do. And I think that as we're thinking about this, we want to know how much of what we're doing is preserving that forest as it is, and how much of it is actually creating some revision to it. So every tree that we address, affects the whole forest is kind of the idea about it. And then when we're actually talking about the systemic issues, what we want to be thinking about is broadly, how do we deal with the ultimate shape and future of the issues we're concerned about. So I'm going to assume that we're all interested in engaging at some level in systemic reform. And in order to do that, there are a couple of things that we want to focus on. And the first thing I would ask you to focus on is what are the infrastructures or the processes that would support systemic change. And there are a couple that that lawyers get involved in that I think are pretty are more likely to be successful. Those include having think tanks, for example. Maybe in an office there's a policy division or a committee that deals with these issues specifically. Whatever you're doing might have a legislative agenda, and that's something that will support systemic change. And just generally, I think collaborative work is going to be a system or a process that's going to support systemic change. All right, so once you have those systems in place or those infrastructures in place, what's the next thing? We want to think about, well, what are the steps? How do we get there? So number one, we want to identify the issues. Number two, we need to document what's going on. And number three, we need to analyze what's going on. So those are just three basic steps in thinking about systemic change. And then we also want to think about, well, ultimately, what's the nature of that change? And when I think about that, the nature of the proposed change, it's the method we're pursuing could be a legislative method, which I've talked about already. Maybe we're going to do it through the courts, through case law, developing some kind of precedent for the policy that we want to put in place. We could do it through new regulations, just changing the regulations, not changing all the law, but just changing what's happening in the government agencies and in rulemaking bodies. We could also engage in a kind of persuasion or education, community work, or with smaller groups of lawyers, community education. We could also engage in rebellious action. All of those things probably want to be on the table for social justice lawyers and thinking about systemic change. A fourth thing that I would add to this, and it's just a smaller question, and that is whether strategically we're thinking about doing something that is a sweeping change, or whether you want to be thinking about change as something that's incremental in its application. So looking at these things, what I want you to, we're going to focus again on a little bit of an exercise. And what I want you to do, again, take out a little sheet of paper or something, and I want you to pick an issue that's something, a systemic issue that matters to you. So maybe it's about gay and lesbian rights, or environmental justice. Maybe you care about a living wage, or maybe you care about the free market. Gang violence, internet privacy, whatever it is. So just pick an issue that matters to you and just free write a little bit about it. Just write a few things without thinking. Just write something about why this matters to you. Okay. So now that you've done that, then I want you to go back to this, and I want you to think carefully about what you know about what government entities and what nonprofits, what private enterprises are actually addressing the issue that you care about. So take a couple of minutes to do that. All right, now finally what I want you to do is I want you to put into this picture, where are the lawyers? Where are the lawyers in this picture, and what are they doing? And finally, what could they be doing? Where could they be useful in the process of doing this? So now that you've got that in mind, I'm going to go back to this, to the question of how do we go about dealing with these things. And I want to talk about the steps in the process of creating a change, a systemic change. The first step in this would be a process of assessment. Let's look at the problem, let's define the problem, let's figure out what it is. And in doing this, I think a lot of times what we find is that lawyers sit around a table talking with each other, and they get all these grand ideas and put them in motion. But I want to add a few other elements that I think are really important to this process of looking at a problem and assessing the problem. And the first thing is I want to think about narrative. That is, what are the stories behind this? Where is this problem? Where are we getting the idea that this is a problem? And who's telling us about it? So narrative is number one. Number two is emotion. Why do people care about these things? What does it make what does it make you feel? What does it make the people who are affected by it feel? What's going into this? And how are people reacting to it? What are the various things that are on the table? And why are these feelings coming up? Kind of related to that is the question of relational realities. And here what I'm talking about is really who is connected to whom, and what relationships are going to be affected by any change that happens in this setting. What's at stake in terms of relationships. A fourth thing, and this will come as no surprise to anybody, I don't think, is the whole notion of power. Who's got it and who doesn't have it. And I would say with respect to power, we want to think about who could have it. And in that respect, I want us to be thinking about, well, what are the resources? Certainly money is one of those things. But other things count too. So time, the number of bodies who can be working, the various connections we have, lots of other things. So social capital becomes really important in this conversation about resources and power. And then finally, of course, what's important in all of this and during the assessment is what are the interests involved? Who's got an interest in what? What do people really want? Not just what they say they want, but what do people really want? So in terms of process of change, this is, these are some elements at looking at how do we begin to assess the problem. And we're always looking at this, I think, in kind of in parallel tracks. We're looking at sort of a process of imagination and aspiration. What is it that we were hoping for? Against a critique of that is, what do we actually have and what is realistic? So we're always looking at both of those things. We're always looking at the ends and we're always looking at the means at the same time. All right, at some point we want to come to a decision-making process. And here I want to talk specifically about legal strategies and what kinds of decision-making is involved here. So again, what can the law do? Well, here are some of the things that the law can do. We know that the law can create a mandate, but more often the law will create some zones of discretion. And that's really important because one of the things in decision making is what is the legal frame for what we're going to be doing. So it fits within some kind of zone of discretion. So it's not necessarily a revolutionary idea, but it is something that that has some flexibility inside of the of a kind of mandate. Law can define relationships, as we know. It can also allocate power. That's obviously something that we want to think hard about when we're thinking about wanting to change something in our systems. It can quantify the outcomes, and it can help us structure goals and interests. So we want to keep all of those things in mind as we're thinking about, well, what's the decision, what's the process that we're going to be using to make an attempt to change the law. So, and then of course our final step in all of this in systemic change is action. And as I mentioned earlier, action can take lots of different forms. We can go after some kind of legislative or regulatory change. We can take cases up and try to make law that way, try to create social change that way. We can engage in some kind of education or persuasion, and then there's rebellious lawyering, and that takes lots of different forms. I think what the bottom line of this is that we want to keep in mind that we've got these goals. Our ambitions are often really grand in terms of systemic change, but change is more often incremental, and so having a view of the long term, the long haul, is really an important aspect of thinking about social justice lawyering. The last thing that I do want to cover, though, is not sort of just buying into the existing status quo, but thinking about how do we actually expand our role as social justice lawyers. And in doing this, I guess it's really kind of an attitudinal shift that I'm thinking about. We've seen that lawyers can do many things, that there are many entry points into the law. But in order for it to really have that long-term effect, in order for it to meet those standards for a cultural shift, I think probably the most important thing for lawyers is that they expand their own thinking about the process of lawyering and their client bases. So I would start with this, that the status quo when we're working on systemic issues in the social justice arena is that we often think about the constituents or the communities we're serving by defining them by their needs or by the services that they receive. So these are people who want to have better housing, who don't have access to the courts, who don't have particular rights. And so whatever it is, we're thinking about these groups often in terms of what they don't have. And there are a lot of risks in doing it, in thinking about our constituents or our communities this way. So first of all, typically when we think about creating change, what we're talking about and what we've been talking about is that there are certain roles that people play in this context, and one of them is that there are the people who have the interests, the stakeholders, and a second thing is that people actually have a voice. They're at the table, they're the spokespersons for the issues, and finally, of course, the decision makers, the people who have the power to make things happen. And what happens when we define our community or our constituents by what they don't have is that that we start thinking about as we think about these groups as not being true stakeholders, but only stakeholders in the sense that they want to obtain what other people have. And so it's a very limited way in which we define what their interests are. The second thing is that there's a tendency then for the community to yield to the people who do have more than they do in those very limited senses. And so as a result, they have a tendency to lose voice there. So it's the haves who do the speaking. And finally, of course, then that puts people now in a subordinated position. They've reduced themselves to a subordinated position because in a way their voice has been taken. And so they lose the power of decision making. And so what I really want to think about is, okay, how do we shift that? How do we think in a different way so that people are not losing their roles as stakeholders, spokespersons, and decision makers? So the positive spin on this, and this is just, kind of, again, sort of just thinking about it, the positive spin on this is that we can start thinking about our communities as having an unbelievable amount of strength, that they come to the table with a lot of strength, a lot of endurance, for example, survival skills, that they do have an authentic voice, and that they're often have been in the habit of developing very sophisticated but informal decision-making processes. So those things are really important to keep in mind. And not only keep in mind, but then the role that we have, or what's asked of us then, is in making the shift to be thinking about our communities as having a greater role in the outcomes, is to, I'd say, ask ourselves a couple of things, or to take a few stands. One is that we want to always consciously be assuming this community perspective, and I talked about that in my last talk. But how does the community define itself? So that should be a question that we're always asking ourselves. What is the community's perspective in this? The second thing is that I think we always want to have in mind that we're interested in empowerment, a very overused word. But what that often means is that we probably have to be thinking about is, should there be a structural change? And what is it that we can do to support or channel other voices in the process? And then the third thing is that the work should be collaborative, should be partnership work. And so we always want to be asking ourselves, who else can I bring into this conversation, and who else can we be looking to support the work that we're doing? Okay. All right, so as the final thing that I want to be thinking about is you. Where do you fit into all of this? And I want to go back to that list that we made at the beginning. And I want you to take a good look at that list. And first of all, I want us to add to that list. After thinking about some of these things in social justice terms, I want us to add to this list. So just thinking more about what social justice lawyers do or could do, I want you to just add a few things to that list. And here are a couple of things that my students added this past semester. They added to the list that lawyers cooperate, they empathize, they give deference, they notice differences, they ask for help, they share, and they redirect community's assets. So, so that's not, these are things that are not ordinarily on people's lists, first lists. So let's add those things to our list. And then I want you to take a look at those lists. And as we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here and defining your own career satisfaction, I want you to take a look at the very long list that you've created, and I want you to circle at least 5 things that you would really enjoy about legal work, things that you really want to be able to do. So circle, at least 5 things. And then I wanted you to go back over this list, and I want you to cross out the things that you hope you never have to do, whatever those are. So just cross out, I don't know, at least 4 or 5 things. If you find yourself crossing out, 30, you might be in the wrong profession, but keep it to a few. And then the question is, so what does this tell you? What does this tell you about who you are, what you want to be, what kind of lawyer you want to be, and where you might fit into the various roles that lawyers can play? There's another way that we can do this, and this involves, you can either interview yourself or you can pair up and interview each other and ask yourselves a couple of questions. And my list of questions about practice preferences would be these. First of all, just very quickly, why do you want to be a lawyer? That's the first thing. And then the second thing would be, and these are a little bit more specific, how much interaction do you want to have with colleagues, and what colleagues? A third thing is, what level of stress are you comfortable with? Do you work well under pressure, or you prefer a more laid-back approach? The fourth thing is, how formal or informal do you want your work environment to be? Maybe how much traveling do you want to do? How much do you want to be away from home? How much time do you want to spend at work on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a yearly basis? And with whom do you want to spend most of your time conversing? So might it be with other professionals, with clients, with politicians, with just a few co-workers, whatever it is. And then finally, how predictable do you like your days and weeks and months to be? So after you've had a chance to do these things, kind of do the list, circles and crossouts on the list, and to have a chance to answer briefly at least some of these questions, what do you want to be thinking about is, how do these things come together? What is it that you believe in? What is it you like to do? How do you want to live and work? And you kind of want to put all these things together, and I think you're going to find that there are a great many ways in which your skills, your interests, your values are going to be able to fit into the many, many roles that social justice lawyers have. So, thank you very much.